Right, I'm on the slideshow titled Roman Empire and working on the slide that says Empire 30 BC to 285 AD. And what I'm going to do, or what I'm not going to do here, is I am not going to go through a bunch of emperors. You know, Claudius did that, and Nero did this, and Hadrian did this thing. I mean, that's interesting in some ways and can help, but what I'm basically going to do is describe how the empire functions and how the empire created the idea of being a Roman beyond, right, the city of Rome or even Italy. So I'm just going to talk about the empire as a thing rather than giving you a step-by-step history of a bunch of emperors. So 285 AD is when the empire will be divided into two by the Emperor Diocletian, and that'll be on the next slideshow, because with the divided empire we go into the late phase of the empire, so it's a different situation in some ways. But so from 30 BC, when Octavian, right, becomes Augustus, the first emperor, to 285 when it's split in two, it's still the empire then, but it has some differences. 250-year period of the peak of the Roman Empire. And as you see from the map, it covers the entire, circles the Mediterranean. It is essentially a Mediterranean empire. This is going to be very important for later on when we get into medieval Europe, which will move away from the Mediterranean, a complete change of civilization in some ways. This is a Mediterranean empire. They've conquered the Mediterranean civilizations. The only bit where they really move away from the Mediterranean is in Gaul, which is modern France, where Julius Caesar had conquered the Celts to give himself more fame and power and glory in his competition with Pompey and Crassus. And then in about 55, the 40s and 50s AD, the Emperor Claudius will invade Britain, partly to give him some credibility. He was more of a scholar than a soldier, so to make sure that people respected him as emperor, Claudius will invade Britain, and Britain is considered a fairly wealthy source of resources: tin, lead. They actually had oysters supposedly at that time, with pearls, and as well as crops and other materials. So it could produce some raw materials for the empire. But those were sort of little side steps that individual people conquered for political reasons as much as anything. And Gaul and Britain will always be sort of backwaters of empire. They're sort of, we have them, we have some legions to defend them, but they're the least important part. Anything facing the Mediterranean, which literally Mediterranean means middle of the earth, that is what's important to the Romans. So we have the empire, okay? But let's look in a little bit more detail at this empire. And so I'm going to go to the next slide. And we really can look at the empire as two significant parts, east and west. And by the way, when we get to 285 and it's divided in two, east and west, that's going to be very important to keep in mind. So the east, which would be the Hellenistic or Greek world around the Aegean Sea, and the Middle Eastern civilizations, and Egypt, so that sort of eastern or right half. Those are, of course, it's highly populated. These have ancient cities that are big and wealthy and productive. You know, you have Athens and Alexandria, and there's a city called Antioch in Syria, which the Seleucids had built to replace the old Phoenician ports. So Antioch and many other cities. And it's big, it's rich, it's the old civilizations. This is where Hellenism, right, the expansion of Greek language and culture, has taken hold. Even under the Roman Empire, Hellenism, this Greek culture and knowledge, is still dominant. We may have the Romans speaking Latin as the language of government, but Hellenism, the culture, the knowledge, the language is still very dominant in the wealthy East. Whereas the West, outside of Italy, remember Italy had a number of old colony towns from the Greeks and the Phoenicians and so forth. And of course, now there's Rome and Syracuse. Italy is moderately, advanced. But pretty much most of the West was a bunch of tribes, Celtic tribes, for example, especially in Spain and France and Britain. Very, very few towns, a couple of colonies on the Mediterranean coast that had been founded. Very, very few towns. It's mostly a source of raw materials for the productive economy in the East. So the population and wealth difference between East and West is significant. And that's actually always what you want to look at in any empire or even country. Okay, where, right, the areas or regions producing the raw materials tend to be poor and low populated because they're just producing food or coal or something. Appalachia is a great example. Whereas the areas that do things with the raw materials, that make things and produce things and sell them and move them around, right, the more urbanized areas tend to have the population and wealth. And so that's not exceptional for Rome, except it's a very broad east-west division rather than regions within there to so much. Like I said, Appalachia, traditionally a coal-producing region, the coal gets shipped out and then it's used to make steel or energy or something elsewhere, and that's where the money and profits are. So it's a good comparison. It's going to be very important for the later Roman Empire too. So, and you get an idea of those cities. There's Athens on the right, with the Acropolis and all these fancy buildings. And there on the left is a drawing of a Roman town where they'd conquered a province in Gaul, and to govern the province, they built a dinky little town. Okay, so the difference is sort of reflected in those. Let's look at this process. Talk about the Romans conquering, and then how do they control the territory? How do we get the process that everybody in the Roman Empire becomes a Roman? It goes beyond the cosmopolitan concept of the Hellenistic. Remember the Hellenistic Greeks? The idea of a cosmopolitan person is a person who saw themselves as a member of the Greek world. But they were still very much a citizen of their city-state, maybe a more loosely a participant in the kingdom they were in, with duties and obligations. And a cosmopolitan was a sort of a loose concept of, we're all Greeks in the Hellenistic world. But in Rome, we're going to literally, during the course of the Roman Empire, virtually everybody is going to see themselves as, I am a Roman. Not just a Roman citizen, which we'll get to that process, but I am a Roman. And that process of becoming Roman, right, taking it beyond the locality or a sort of a vague concept of us Greeks are all sort of one, is a very powerful, it's almost taking citizenship to the modern level, right? I'm a citizen of the United States of America. Okay, 300 and some million of us, right? That's a big group to consider oneself part of. And the Romans sort of begin that process. So we'll go to the next slide, which is Romanization, becoming a Roman. Now, at first, right, only Italians, remember after the Social War, only Italians are Roman citizens. But people outside of Italy, in the areas around the Roman Empire, also had paths to citizenship. And this is kind of cool. There's a path to citizenship for these people. They're not going to be simply treated as a conquered people and held down, which the Greeks more or less did, right? The Greeks were the rulers of the various kingdoms and the local people sort of under them. The Romans are going to, probably because they'd already done it with the Italians, why not bring other people in? And it's also a way of keeping the peace, right? If there's a path for people to become Roman and to become the rulers and become participants in the system, they're less likely to rebel or to revolt. One way to citizenship is to join the Roman army. Remember, there are no more hoplites, no more each territory. Like in the Persian Empire, each territory produced its own army to fight for the emperor. There is only one army. It is the Roman army. And you could join the Roman army. And so you didn't need to be a citizen to join the army, right? So it takes that old citizen soldier concept from the citizen state, and now it's like, no, this is the professional army. You join it. After you've done your service in the army, you come out as a Roman citizen. One path to citizenship. Another way, and this is more for the elites, the equivalent of the patrician class, those landowners around the empire, would be brought in by the Romans to help them as local government. So you might start out before the Roman conquest as a Celtic chieftain, and then after the Roman conquest, right, once you've surrendered to the Romans, they may say, hey, you help us rule your tribe. And they would build a little town, which we'll talk a bit more about. And then you sort of become part of the Roman government running that area. So you start being a Celtic chieftain, and you and definitely your descendants become eventually part of the Roman patrician class. And down the road, actually, there are emperors. By the time you get to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, there are emperors who are not from Rome or Italy, that they came through the army or government or some combination of the two, worked their way up and made connections and end up being emperor. So that path to citizenship is very, very, very effective for ordinary people in the army or for patrician class, right, going through as governors. And right, you might start out, my grandfather was a Celtic chieftain. My father was the first governor of this tribal area under the Romans, and now I'm the provincial governor of Egypt, even though I'm from Britain, but I've moved myself up and got the eye of the emperor, and he said, hey, go be the Egyptian governor, and I'm a Celt, or the descendant of a Celtic chieftain. So it's kind of cool. Doesn't mean everything was all totally happy, especially after initial conquest. It's bloody, it's nasty. The Romans will loot everything and take everything. But down the generations, it settles down. This path of promotion, whether through the army or through the government, is called the cursus honorum, literally means the root of honors. And like I said, it was open to anybody, and you became a citizen in that process. And that is the secret to everybody becoming Roman. That being a Roman is open to everybody. There's not us and you, us and them, right? There's no separation. It's like, here's how you become Roman. Latin is the language of government. And so to be Roman, you learn Latin, and it becomes in many ways the language of trade and commerce, because the Romans dominate it. So you learning Latin sort of helps you become Roman. It becomes necessary since they run the place. And that's part of the process of becoming Roman, right? I'm participating in the Roman system. I'm speaking the language. It's part of the process. And over time, the Romans will replace local laws as everything becomes more and more Romanized, and they'll have a more universal Roman law. Roman law will be applied to everybody. So whereas maybe in the early part of the Roman Empire, you might have a local king who's sort of working alongside the Roman governor, and the local king still enforces his own laws and his people speak their own language. After a century or two, it takes time, you just have a Roman governor, and they're speaking Latin, and they're enforcing Roman law. Part of the process. And in fact, then by it'll be so let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned towns. What the Romans do when they conquer an area, mostly in the West, the East already, remember, has lots of towns. So those towns just become Roman provincial capitals. But in the West, there's no towns. So they build them. They're not very big, where they build towns. Every tribal area that had been conquered has a small town. It might be a few hundred people or a couple of thousand, and that small town becomes the equivalent to a county capital, right? It's where the court is and where the taxes go, and it's where they govern that tribal. So no longer a tribal chief, it's a small, tiny Roman town with Roman government. That helps provide Romanization, right? You've brought towns and cities to the West where there were few or none before, and people are governing out of those cities. And of course, culture and so forth. So towns scattering across most of the West, like I said, already in the East. And also, right, I mentioned those little chiefs and so forth. And again, this is mostly in the West. The East is already civilized. You stop building your classic barbarian chief's hall, and this patrician class, or what becomes the patrician class, the old nobles, start building Roman villas, Roman style villas, even if it's in Britain. They have to invent heating because villas were designed for the Mediterranean climate. In Britain, it's more cold and foggy, so they have to design heating systems and modify them, but it's still a Roman villa. So if you went into Britain, for example, in 100 in the year 0, okay, there's a bunch of Celtic tribes in their hill forts and chieftains and so forth. You go 150 years later, let's say 150 AD, about 100 years after their conquest, and then you have some little Roman towns and the descendants of the chiefs are in the Roman villas, and it looks Roman. So the culture, right, is changing. Not just the laws and the process of becoming a Roman, but the fabric of the civilization itself. And talking about culture, I will go to the next slide, which says culture. And what you have here is, for the vast majority of people, they are peasants, and they are still essentially speaking their own language. Okay. For example, in a big part of the Middle East, including the kingdom, the province that the Romans take over, that was the various Hebrew kingdoms, becomes Palestine. So the province of Palestine, right? They still speak Aramaic, and they worship their own gods, or God in that case, and they have their own culture. So you're being Romanized, but there's still, for the majority of people, it's your own thing. The Romans leave you alone as long as you keep the peace and pay your taxes. Okay, so there's your local culture, which is a lot of people. For the higher classes in the East, right, they have Greek. They have the Hellenistic culture, and I'll stay with the province of Palestine in the Roman province of Palestine, right? The educated Hebrews there have if you remember, long learned Greek and are writing in Greek. And of course, as you know, the New Testament of the Christian Bible is written in Greek by these Hellenistic, right, educated Hebrews. They still speak Aramaic like the rest of the population, but there's a layer of Hellenistic knowledge still there in the East. And then in East and West, so there's virtually zero Hellenism in the West, which again is going to be very important for after the Roman Empire, right? When the Roman Empire collapses, there's no Hellenism to sort of replace it like there is there will be in the East. So crucial. East and West, of course, the Roman Empire, as we've been talking about, you have the Roman culture, villas and Roman language, and so forth at the top, Roman law. So it's almost like a layer cake, the thickest layer being the local language and culture, and then in the East a layer of Hellenism, and then over both of them a layer of Roman culture. So it's sort of an interesting mix. But you could have someone that's bi or trilingual, right? They might speak Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, 3 languages, for example, or wherever, or Celtic and Latin, for example, over in Gaul in France. So it's a complex complex culture. But over time, right, Latin is deeply embedded as more and more people use it for government and so forth. Right, so what I'll do is I'll cut off this lecture because I'll do a short lecture on Christianity as that spreads through the empire. But you've basically got a description. What I've done in this 20 minutes is give you a description of how the empire works and what it does. And what I forgot to mention, and I need to mention, and it's perfect, is in the year 235, there are so many people who are Roman citizens or are essentially Roman that the emperor basically says everybody in Rome is a Roman citizen. So in the 3rd century AD, everybody's a Roman citizen. You don't have to follow that path. Enough people have done it. Their descendants are Romans, and other people have found ways. We're all Romans. And it's almost like a footnote, like, okay, fine, yay, technicality. Now we are all officially Roman citizens. So literally, the millions of people around the empire have become Roman citizens, and they're like, yeah, of course we are. Pretty cool. So let's look at Christianity next.